So again, an American focus. If you look at the 1990s, if you look at the Pierce Brosnan films, you had, for example, as plots to do with Russian crime syndicates, plots to do with the control of oil from the Black Sea, plots to do, Tomorrow Never Dies, to do with the press baron who is overmighty, trying to get into the Chinese market and willing to cause devastation to do so, which is clearly a very thinly veiled attack on Rupert Murdoch. And the last one, of course, you've got the concern with North Korea and the possibility that North Korea will attack the South and start off a major war. So the plots have to work to a certain extent, as adventure fiction usually does have to work, by being at least in part related to the real world. They're not like science fiction, where there is a greater remove from what can happen. I mean, science fiction often relates to anxieties about the real world, as in, anxieties about Martians in the 1950s linked to anxieties about communists, but at least, you can have all sorts of implausible creatures and implausible planets in science fiction, which you cannot do in adventure hero stories. At the same time, the social, the racial, the gender and the sexual politics have all changed in the films. Now, if you start off in the 1960s, it is very much a set of values in the films which fitted in with what were then dominant male norms. For example, if you take From Russia with Love, there is a scene back in London where the people are listening in the intelligence headquarters, the people are listening to James Bond's interview with his the Soviet woman he's trying to turn, and in fact to seduce, and about the Lecter, the Soviet deciphering machine. And every single character is chain smoking. Smoking is an absolute norm of the 1960s, and in fact smoking again very much seen in the Roger Moore things. Roger Moore is frequently with a cigarette, or more commonly with a cigar. Well, again, total change. Tomorrow Never Dies. James Bond comes in, you see, it's rather an interesting form of cinema. The camera is behind me, right? I'm James Bond, I'm not obviously, but the camera is behind me. I am walking forward. You've got an Afghan guard sitting there smoking, and here's the Afghan guard. James Bond comes in, he pulls the cigarette out of his mouth, smashes him in the face, knocking him out, says filthy habit, and then walks into the picture. The idea of smoking being a filthy habit, or even to the point of a joke, would have been implausible earlier. But that's, you've got that by the 1990s. Even more, as an example of change, is the change in terms of the sexual politics of the film and the gender politics. It had been a very comfortable male-dominated world, the depiction of the intelligence services in both the novels and the early films. James Bond is the young man, he answers to the old man, M, who runs the system. N is a decent fellow, in the stories he's an ex-military type, a former admiral, and the assumption always is that these two men understand each other and understand how to achieve the task. Well, 1994 in GoldenEye, you have a complete change. You have a female M, played by the actress Judi Dench, who still plays the role, very good in the role. She makes it absolutely clear-cut to Bond that she's quite willing to send him to his death if necessary. And she makes it quite clear repeatedly in the plots that she is resourceful, intelligent, morally brave, and fully up to the job. There's an exchange at the beginning of Tomorrow Never Dies. I mean, Bond is in this Afghan terrorist bazaar high up in the mountains of the Pamirs, and they're discussing back in the Cabinet War Room in London whether they should send a cruise missile out of a British warship in the Indian Ocean to destroy the stuff there. And Judi Dench, M, is saying, well, we shouldn't do this, it's entirely possible there'll be nuclear armaments up there, and we really shouldn't risk sending a cruise missile, because if there's a detonation of nuclear stuff, it's going to cause amazing devastation. The head of the armed forces, played by a character called Admiral Roebuck, turns to her and says, the problem with you, M, is that you haven't got any balls. classic male put-down line. And she retorts as quick as anything, well, at least I don't think with mine. And of course she's right and he's wrong as the plot develops. So she is repeatedly correct, major change. As far as the sexual side is concerned, in that very film, GoldenEye, 1994, James Bond tries to chat up Miss Moneypenny. Miss Moneypenny is the secretary of M. Now, in all of the earlier films, bar one, Miss Moneypenny had been played by the Canadian actress Lois Maxwell, who had played her, as she was asked to play her, as a rather drippy woman, very dependent on James Bond, wishing desperately to get married to him. So in Diamonds Are Forever, he says to her, I'm off to Holland, is there anything that you'd like me to bring back? And she says, oh yes, a diamond on a ring. Her great aspiration is to be James Bond's girlfriend, and she never is. Right. Well, totally different sexual politics in 1994. She and James Bond are in what we call a lift, what you call an elevator, and he's trying to chat her up. And she turns to him, played by the actress Samantha Bond, a very good actress, she turns to him and says, and just think about this, think about how unacceptable this line would be if a male actor said it to a female actress, but perfectly okay the other way round. She says to him, tell me James, I can't remember, have I ever had you? In other words, the idea that he would be totally unmemorable sexually, and that he would just be one of her many conquests. So a complete and utter turnaround in the sexual politics. And that's linked, of course, to a turnaround in the racial politics. If you look at most of the films, there is classically a good girl and a bad girl. And the good girl is usually a drop-dead, gorgeous blonde, and the bad girl is usually darker of skin, and usually has dark hair, okay? And usually an implausible name, so, Xenia on a top, or Fatima Blush, some ludicrous name. And generally what happens is the bad girl is quite happy to have sex with Bond, and sometimes then tries to kill him. Fatima Blush is a good example of that. But the good girl is the girl he really would like. It's all sort of 1950s and twee and a bit ridiculous. But that's the standard plot. Well, they changed that completely in the 1990s and into the 2000s. You get the good girl being a successful and accomplished Secret Service agent in her own right. For example, the one played by Halle Berry, the one played by Michelle Yeoh. And of course, in the case of Halle Berry, she's an African-American. In the case of Michelle Yeoh, she's Chinese. So first of all, you have non-white female leads who are brilliant as brilliant as spies, physically fit, and well up to the job. And secondly, you reach the situation where sometimes when you get introduced to the blonde, like the Miranda Frost character, they're actually the villains. So you transpose what had been the established narrative, the established character narrative. And of course James Bond himself is changing, because whereas in the Roger Moore films, reflecting the values, or at least what could be presented as the values in the 1970s and 1980s, he often has more than one girlfriend or more than one sexual partner in a film. By the 1990s, James Bond's become a serial monogamist. Each film, one girlfriend, different girlfriends in each film, but he's changed, and it's become, he no longer smokes, or he only actually drinks in order to come out with his trademark line about shaken but not stirred, and nothing else. He really is not anymore somebody who's a great sexual conqueror. One thing that he does do, which again is very different from the James Bond of the novels, is he kills people in large numbers. And indeed, that is an aspect of the way in which films have become more violent. If you think about The Mask of Zorro, you've got exactly the same. In the 1930s original, there's a lot of fighting, but only one person is killed in the entire film, and that's the villain, Basil Rathbone, in a very long sword fight at the end. If you look at the remake, vast numbers get killed. And indeed, I did a radio interview in 2000 with a chap called Oleg Gordievsky, who'd been the KGB station chief in London in the early 80s. And during that time, before that he'd been KGB station chief in Copenhagen, and during that time he'd been an MI6 agent. In other words, he was a Soviet traitor, but working for us, so he found it expedient to defect and live in Britain, which is where he lives at the moment. And he was interviewed for this radio programme I did on James Bond. And he said a number of things. The most fascinating thing he said was that there was a standing instruction to the London station to get hold of a print of the latest James Bond film when it came out, because the Central Committee liked watching James Bond films, which is, that's the Central Committee of the Communist Party. That is bizarre if you think about it, because if you know the James Bond films, you will know that at the beginning of the film Octopussy, they're actually showing a meeting, a fictional meeting, of the Central Committee discussing whether to invade Western Europe. So the idea of them all sitting there and watching it. The same thing, incidentally, about North Korea. The current dictator of North Korea likes watching James Bond films and took violent exception to the last of the Pierce Brosnan films, in which a North Korean is shown killing his father. Got really cross about that. He said no North Korean would ever kill his father, but the idea of these dictators watching these films is really quite amusing. Anyway, Gorievsky said that the one thing that he objected to really about the James Bond films was the killings. And he specified GoldenEye, and the way that in GoldenEye, James Bond hijacks this tank in St. Petersburg and goes careering around the streets of St. Petersburg, crushing police cars, assumingly, one assumes killing the people within them. And he said how abhorrent he found this. And indeed, I think it's fair to say that the films have become much more violent. They have now many fights that are unnecessary to the plot sequence. If you think of the remake with Daniel Craig of Casino Royale, if you know that film very well, the chase sequence in Madagascar and the fight at Miami Airport are both actually unnecessary to the plot. And certainly there is no equivalent to what you would have got in the early films with conversation used to establish character. So if you go to the film Goldfinger, there is a 9-minute film sequence in which James Bond and Goldfinger play a game of golf. The only violence in that is that a golf ball gets crushed. And essentially what you see is Goldfinger trying to win by cheating and James Bond out cheating him. But it's both what the filmmakers are using it to do is establish the characters of the true protagonists and their natures. It is inconceivable today that a James Bond film would have 9 minutes without a fight, or some adventure sequence, or some chase. And in part that is because, which is what is interesting for the historian, it's because the nature of the film market has changed. In the early 60s, as I said, as today, the world's leading film market was the United States. Anybody like to tell me what the world's second largest film market was in 1962? Anybody? Well, the answer is Britain. And the point being that those two film markets, I mean, Oscar Wilde's famous remark about two countries being divided by a common language, but at least both those film markets can understand English. The skill now is to produce films which work well for people for whom English is a second language or who are uncomfortable with English. Most of the great film markets now, other than the American film market, are in Asia. So in Japan, where James Bond is Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. In India, where there is enormous watching of James Bond films. In the Persian Gulf, where they can't be shown in cinemas, but where they're watched on videos and nowadays in DVDs. These are all very major markets for the Bond films. And because of that, you need to put an emphasis on the action sequences and to play down the characters. So it's quite interesting to see how a global product, how globalization works in the cinema. And indeed, globalization is working. It's been estimated now for over 15 years that more than half the world's population has watched a James Bond film, which means you have the slightly bizarre situation where probably the most famous Briton of the last century after Churchill is James Bond. James Bond, Princess Di, probably on a and what one has to then start to think about if you're historians is what is the impact of fictional norms, fictional tropes in the perception of the real world. certainly isn't very important within Britain, because although James Bond is very popular, the British don't see themselves really in terms of the James Bond films. They're very popular, but they are, as it were, visually in the background. They're part of a past world in a way. The young, in particular, people of the generation of most students here, do not watch James Bond films much now. They're really their older's generation, and they're an extremely successful film franchise. It's currently the second most successful film franchise in history. Star Wars is the most successful. But they are finding it harder to grip the younger generation. For the olders, they're quite important. To give you an idea, and this gives you an idea of a world that has passed but is very, very recent. Think about a world before cable television, before satellite television, before videos, and before DVDs. Sounds awful to you youngsters? We're talking about the 1980s. And in fact, as far as Britain is concerned, we're talking about most of the 90s as well. What that meant is you could create a common experience in a way you simply cannot do now. So what would happen classically, and remember, Britain, you're a continent pretending to be a country. You're spread over many time zones, you have many different cultures. In the case of Britain, everything's in one time zone. It's a tiny little country compared to America. And as a result of this, you can have a common experience. Sort of Christmas Day was always a common experience for the Brits. They would usually sit down in miserable weather outside to have an overheated dry turkey for lunch, and with people they didn't really get on with, namely their family. And then at 3 o'clock they would switch on the television, and on all channels you get the Queen, or you still get the Queen at 3 o'clock on Christmas afternoon, and the Queen essentially says, be nice, get on with your family, and shows you a few sort of pictures of what she's been doing in the last the last year, and it's all over in 5 minutes, and it's quite sort of, well, everybody knows what's going to happen. The Queen's fairly predictable. So you watch the Queen for 5 minutes, and then in the 1980s and 1990s, you would get, and you still sometimes get it, but it doesn't have the same impact now because of DVD and video and satellite, you would get a James Bond film on ITV television, which was the leading commercial channel. And at that stage, there was only 2, and then eventually only 4 terrestrial television channels. Most televisions, for a long time, would only take 2 channels. So what you could therefore do is have a situation in which the population is now over 60 million, but we're talking about a situation where the population was about 56, 57, 58 million people. You could have a situation in which over 25 million people were watching, not everybody watching the television, were watching the same programme at the same moment. Now, it gives you an idea of a different world. This is the world, as it were, before you could freeze the television. This was on commercial television, so they would have intervals to show adverts. During the intervals, everybody in Britain did exactly the same thing. They switched on their electric kettle in order to make a cup of tea. In Britain, we have something called the National Grid. There is a monopoly provider of electricity at that level. The result being that all the power stations are linked up together. The electric kettles, I don't know if any of you have seen an electric kettle, they boil water very, very fast. The result being is they use an enormous amount of electricity. The impact of having roughly over 10 million electric kettles switched on at once was so great for the National Grid that it used to have to keep 3 power stations extra for a Christmas Day afternoon, ready to deal with the power surges in order to provide the breakdowns. Now, that in a way is an amusing story, but it also captures the way in which cultural figures of a certain period could speak to a generation or a country in a way that's very difficult now. And I think that's quite important when people now look at cultural models. They look at, for example, something like Hogwarts, or they look at the current figures that are important in terms of popular culture, because they don't have necessarily the same resonance. But having said that, it is still important for historians to try and think about changing cultural mediums, changing cultural figures, because in studying the way in which these alter and studying the way these develop, you get ideas of how societies change. So for those of you, obviously the majority of you are Americans, for those of you who are Americans, you could do exactly the same thing as I've been doing if you were to talk about changing views of Superman, changing views of Batman, or to produce other characters, and study the way in which, whilst on the one hand obviously there is a ludicrous element of fictionality about them, nevertheless they also tell us things about societies, and they capture in some respects their deepest fears and anxieties. And for a historian, one of the real difficulties when you look at a society is to capture its deep, dark fears. And one of the ways of doing that is to look at imaginative fiction and to look at how it changes. Thank you very much.